Well, hi, this is Justin. I'm going to bring down this music a little bit. And I'm going to get this down here. Sorry about that. I had one of the speakers on, which in fact I should not have, so um, we want to keep that off if we can. I want to welcome you to this broadcast. We're going to be about a half an hour, and I wanted to tell you can call in, and you can see that number basically if you're on the Soul Speak page, or if you know how to Twitter. You know, most of us haven't figured that out yet at our age, but if you're a youngster, you know you're twittering me in here, and I try to answer them as the opportunity arrives. Listen, what I wanted to talk to you about is we want to get down to some basics here. I don't know if you're expecting me to pull Dracula out of my back pocket or some kind of monster like you see in the popular TV shows about the psychic world, but that's just the pop culture's view of the psychic world, and it's very distorted because our culture itself is distorted. There is a real problem in our culture in that the worldview, or whatever you want to call it, says there's only one world, and that is this world, the physical world that we can knock on, and that's it. There is nothing else, and yet there is something in us that continues to sense that there is something else, and therefore the great appeal of these psychic movies and TV shows and monsters coming out. And the reason they're coming out as monsters is just simply because it's a fear reaction, because most people in fact today's culture don't understand the psychic world or the world of the unconscious, and because they don't understand it, they're afraid of it. You know, it's just a little bit too much. And indeed there are many people who are completely puzzled about what a psychic event is, as the only real insight they have, if you're going to call it insight, is what they see on TV or in the movies with ghouls coming out and out of the walls and things like that. I believe in the psychic world. I've never seen a ghost. I've never seen a spirit. My particular psychic gifts happen to be related to an occasional psychic voice, and once or twice in my life a vision. They usually come in times of great stress or great creative activity, and I think that's when most people experience psychic voices or visions, and they're completely different from what our popular culture would have us believe. You know, they're just not even in the same ballpark. There are horrendous visions that occur. You know that the book of Revelations in the Bible, in the New Testament, is a reporting of a vision that was terrifying to John, and he wrote it down in all its terror. But those are extremely rare occurrences, and they're really eruptions of what you can call the collective unconscious, of a kind of racial unconscious that comes up, a cultural unconscious, if you will, that rises up and chooses someone to work its way through. Most people's psychic activity, there's a small percentage of us hear an occasional voice, and or on very rare occasions will have a vision of something, awake, not asleep. You know, when you're waking and you hear a voice that has the same clarity, it sounds like somebody speaking to you, but you know there's nobody there. It has a quality to it, and that quality is that there's an authority to the voice, and there's a truth to the voice. You simply have to pay attention to it. It's usually a guiding voice of some kind. Don't do that. I had one at one stage of my life when I was drinking very heavily and doing a little bit too many narcotics in the form of marijuana, and I was ruining my life, and I couldn't stop. And I remember coming home one night, and I was stopped at a parking light, completely out of it, as you might imagine, and looking up at the red light, and all of a sudden the voice came in my head, "Change your life." It made me stand straight up in the car. soon after I stopped everything, because I knew the voice was coming from someplace, I don't know, within me or without me, but it wasn't my voice. It wasn't the conscious mind that I know, and I paid attention to it. For those people who haven't had a conscious psychic event happen to them, who'll come up to me and say, well, Justin, that's fine, but I think you're just hallucinating, or I say, these aren't hallucinations. I've had hallucinations. I know what they're like. They're disturbing and they're deranged. These visions and voices, that they are beautiful and they are true, and you always have a sense of being spoken to from a higher level of intelligence. That's just the way it is. They are your guides in terms of stress or in terms of creativity. So that we're left in a kind of dilemma today as to how to speak to people who haven't experienced psychic events. They think that the people who do are crazy, and what we think about those people is they're living half a life. The world of logic and reason can only take you so far, and the world of intuitive visions and voices, when they come to you, can only take you so far. But the two of them give you a better chance at living a fully developed life. And I would say this also, is that it's part of our humanity. You can equate the soul with the unconscious if you want, That's what Carl Jung did, and I think it's a pretty good equal signs. We think of sometimes the unconscious as some kind of garbage dump of sexual desires, but it's a feeling intelligence that is both within us and seems to extend beyond our boundaries. That's all we can say about it, That sometimes we get information that we had no way of knowing as a human being, from some other time or place or some other intelligence. But that still leaves us with the problem about, what do I mean by the psychic unconscious roots of poetry? That's the real thing. Is this guy off his rocker, or is he nuts, or what's happening? That insight came to me as a result of about 10 or 12 years ago. I discovered how to create poetry by spontaneously speaking it. I'm not talking about thinking about a poem and memorizing it half in your head and then kind of spieling it out. I'm talking about letting the unconscious rise up and speak through us in the manner of how poems were created when we were in a preliterate stage. Homer says at the beginning of his great epics, and he was the last of our great preliterate poets, sing, muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending. He's speaking about Odysseus, of course, but who he's really invoking is the muse. And the muse is another word for the psychic presence, and is also another word for the unconscious, for the creative unconscious. He's asking the muse to help him create a poem by singing through him, just considering himself to be an instrument of sorts, And that's what I discovered was entirely possible even today. We can't do it to the extent that our ancestors did, because our consciousness has changed. We have a pretty thick barrier between our unconscious and our conscious minds. Going back in time, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years, that barrier was quite thin, I think, and people moved between the two quite easily. When we learned to read and write, things changed, and we began to get our solid, conscious, logical mind that says this is all there is, and yet some of us have come to see that that's really a crazy assumption, because there are other things that are speaking to us besides logic. Well, with that said, let me just give you a surprise for those of you who have never had a psychic experience, who go through life with a little badge on your shoulder says, I'm totally rational and I live in this world and everybody else is nuts and there are no such things. These people are hallucinating, they don't know what they're talking about, etc., etc. And here's the surprise. Everybody has had a psychic experience. In fact, they have them very often, because every time that you have an orgasm is a psychic experience. It's a psychic event, and by a psychic event, I think that I can take the events that have happened to me, that form a broad range of them, is they come unbidden, That is, you might know something's going to happen, but all of a sudden you reach a certain point and there's nothing you can do to stop the orgasm. It's a mating. Let's assume it's a mating, so we see that something's going on with somebody else, because it helps to bring an example forth that I want to tell you about. What happens is that it arrives and it takes us out of our current consciousness, our everyday consciousness, and it moves us to something else where we're one with everything around us. Heaven blazing into the head, as Yeats said, and it's a good description of a poem as well as an orgasm, because they share a lot in common. And what happens is that we lose our current consciousness, we acquire another one which is universal, which takes in everything around us, and we experience a moment of beauty and truth. You know, Keats said, truth is beauty, beauty, truth, that's all you need to know, something like that. I'm kind of quoting him, maybe a little inexactly, but that's about what he said. And what it means at that moment of truth is beautiful to humans. That mating, whatever it is a beautiful moment that seems that it's heavenly, I guess is the best way to describe it. We're out of our minds, just the same way that animals are out of their minds. If you watch animals mate, they'll kind of nose around like we do, and all of a sudden there's no turning back, and one of the hippos mounts the other hippo, and they go at it for a few minutes or seconds. It's sometimes fast, sometimes slow. You can't tell in the animal world. And then one hops off the other, and they walk around dazed. That's about what happens to us. We like to think that we're in control, but the moment of orgasm and the moments that lead up to it, we're completely out of control. It's our most animal state that we can get into. It's also one of our most ecstatic states that everybody experiences. It's one where we leave our current consciousness, it grabs a hold of us, sweeps us away into a moment of beauty and ecstasy. So that's, if you think that you've never had a psychic experience because you only think that they come when Dracula comes out of the wall or when worms come out of your nose and all the rest of that stuff, you know, you got to wake up. You have to take a look at what's happening to you every day of your life, and every day of your life, or every couple of days, hopefully, you know, if you're still lucky in that degree, you're gonna mate and have an orgasm, and you're gonna go out of your mind. You're gonna become one with something, and it's gonna be an ecstatic, beautiful moment. That moment of that mating, or that orgasm, let's talk about it that way, as a mating orgasm, is slightly different from the voices and visions that I've experienced, and I think that's true for everybody. The visions and the voices bring about a moment of high truth. You have to listen to the vision or the voice, what it is telling you. But it's not a moment of ecstasy, and it doesn't sweep you out of your current consciousness. They're like guides that appear and speak inside you, to you, and there's a reality to it. You know it's not a physical voice, but it's the same as a physical voice, and you know what you're seeing is not in the physical world, but it looks as though it's in the physical world. You know, when a figure appears to you, as one did to me many years ago in my bathroom mirror, that was not of this time and space, you know. You know it's a vision, but it has a reality to it, and you pay attention. What is going on here, you know? So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And then we're going to go slide over a little bit like this, and we're going to take a look at poetry. Poetry and the act of mating, the orgasm that's involved in mating, are extremely close. I would say it's one step up from the visions and the voices. It's very close to the orgasm. What happens is that a poem, as everyone knows, unless they're just constructing rhymes, and that's not really a poem, that's just a little verse that you're constructing, is that it arrives unbidden. You never know when the poem is going to arrive to you if you're a poet, or if you're just an ordinary person who has written one or two poems in their life. Usually when you're a teenager is when it occurs, and then we just lock up and we go into Dumbsville. But if we happen to be that kind of person that the poems keep coming to us, and we allow them to, and we understand something is happening that is sacred or divine, I can apply those words to it because that's how it just feels to me, something of a higher order. We surrender to that feeling when it comes to us. What it does, it sweeps us away, and out of our unconscious, or out of the psychic realm, whatever you want to call it, it's beyond our control, a poem arrives, which is a story that has some very special characteristics. It's rhythmic, and it's metaphoric, meaning it speaks in metaphors. It's not a story like go to the grocery store and get me a bottle of beer. if you do have a poem like that that comes out, it's not really talking about a bottle of beer, and it's not really talking about the grocery store. Those might be the surface level, but it's talking about something deep, because the unconscious only speaks in metaphors. So that's why interpreting dreams can be very tricky business, you know. And what happens is it comes rhythmically. There's a rhythm to it that's imparted by the unconscious to us. It comes automatically. It's sometimes a little different from culture to culture, but it has its own natural rhythm. We can enforce another rhythm on top of it if we wish. That's done sometimes by poets. I just wish that they wouldn't, but they want to show off, so they go ahead and do it. But it's a natural iambic rhythm that happens to come out, and it comes out in terms of a story that is metaphoric and that is rhythmic, and it comes in a moment of ecstatic beauty and ecstatic truth. What is really happening, and I'm not going to back this up, but I'm just going to say it to you because I've come to believe this after many years of trying to look at the act of poetry, is that I believe that it's a mating of the unconscious, which can run extremely deep, by the way, and the conscious mind. It's the conscious mind wants to speak to us. It's a feeling intelligence. It's not a physical intelligence. You can call it a metaphysical, whatever you want to call it. But it's basically something that is non-physical, and it rises up within us. Who can say where the heck it's coming from? Some poems are so strange, I have no idea where they're coming from. And they come up, and if you surrender to them, especially if you speak them out, which is a lost art, which is something that I kind of rediscovered with some other poets 10 or 12 years ago. I call it soul speak. It's a contemporary version of ancient oral poetry, but it sounds contemporary, meaning it sounds like we're speaking today, but it has all the characteristics of that. The impulse of the unconscious to communicate with us, to mate with us, to make us whole again, comes through, and it comes out as a story poem, a metaphoric story poem. That the only difference between a poem coming to me and an orgasm is that the orgasm is, of course, stronger, but it has exactly the same characteristics, and you poets have known this since time immemorial. So that the psychic content of a poem coming through, it has a special quality to it. It's not as directive as the guiding voices or visions. It's a ball of feelings that becomes a story. And when we make the story, it's my particular belief, and I'll get into this a little later, it's not really important to do it now, is that the unconscious wants to hear the sound of that poem, wants to hear the sound of what it is like to be human, to live in time, because that's what we do. Humans live in time and tell stories. That's a big statement, but in fact, I'm simply going to say that what distinguishes us from the animals is that we tell stories. I'm not talking about demands. Animals know how to make demands. They have emotions, they have memory, they have logic. And the higher order ones are pretty impressive as to what they can do. But what they can only say is, I'm hungry, or I'm angry, or let's go, or something like that. It's basically, they live in the present. There is no past for animals. There is no memory of our kind, because what stories are somehow, at some stage of our development as very smart animals, one of us was born and was able to reach into memory and fashion out of it a whole new world. Once upon a time, this happened. I went down to the river and I drank water and I was happy. That's something no animal has ever done, nor no animal will ever do. And the puzzle about it is, since it makes us the most superior animal of all time, why has it happened to other animals? No one knows. Happened to us, humans. And so what happens is that we became a nation of, or a race of storytellers, humans. And whether the story is in the beginning or E equals MC squared, it's still a story. That's what distinguishes us, and we're a collection of stories. And poems are very special stories that want to restore us into our wholeness. And I'll put it to you this way. This is a big statement, but I figure, why not? Let's just throw it out. I've come to believe, and I can never prove, I can just kind of you throw it out as a kind of theoretical thing, that what we call our unconscious, what Jung called our unconscious, it's a feeling intelligence that seems to have roots back to the beginning of time and across physical boundaries. That was just the proof that he came up with, that in our dreams and in our visions we know things that we couldn't possibly know as individual human beings, you know. So that the thing that we are storytellers, and the poems are a way, if we can imagine going back to a stage hundreds of thousands of years ago when we were still animals. Now, not one of us had become human yet, and by human, we were born with a desire to tell stories, not even knowing what stories were, just wanted to communicate in a way beyond a command. I believe when that happened, when that consciousness developed, which we call human consciousness, it developed out of the animal consciousness, which is a feeling in the present consciousness, intuitive consciousness. And you separate it, but they remain together. There are little feelers going back and forth between the two, which is why we can sometimes get messages from the unconscious and why we can communicate again with the unconscious by going back. Those little feelers, whatever you want to call them, those two halves didn't divorce themselves. So in our very early stages that are unconscious, which is much more complicated now because it's absorbed a lot of our consciousness, or things that are stories, for example, okay? That's a pretty good indication, is that it wants to communicate with us. It's a brother. It knows who we are, but it can't say anything to us. It wants to communicate with us. And poems have been the way that it's done this since time immemorial. And poems, just poems, not that kind of fancy poems you see in quarterlies or anything like that, but the poems you would see in pre-literate cultures that come up spontaneously in very early stages of their development. And in fact, I'll give you some samples of those later. What happens at that moment of ecstasy that we feel when a poem arrives, which is initiated by the unconscious, by the muse, by the psychic world, by God, by the soul, name it whatever you want, it arrives in order to mate with us, to bring us back together again for a second moment. Wants to become whole again with us. And people who are wise surrender to that and become whole. One of the reasons I've come to believe, because I had a lot of manic depression in me, and since I started to do this type of poetry, I'm not so much concerned with the outcome, whether it's published or I win prizes. I'd like to, I could use some money, but I just do poems all of the time, because if you get into the habit of it, you're constantly mating with your unconscious. Your conscious is approaching you and you coming back. Your conscious wants you to come back. You know, if you're kind of a sluggard and you I'm gonna have a beer, poets wouldn't really do that. And in fact, if you ever get the impulse to a poem, you should surrender to it and do it and work the poem through as quickly and as honestly as you can, whether you write it down or whether you speak it out at that time. I prefer speaking because it's automatic. You have less chance of losing it as it comes to you, you know. But what that moment of wholeness does is when all of the things that are moving through us, you can think of our consciousness as a very glittery, large lake, and the surface reflects the world. It reflects the moon. We can look at it, we can see ourselves. We can look at it even deeper and see our loved ones, down there. We can see the dog who's next to us, and see the house on the hill. But it's just a glittery surface consciousness. And what's really moving the surface and making it reflect certain ways and making the waves come up and moving in and out and suddenly erupting is the unconscious, which is always trying to come up and to mate with a conscious mind and become one for a moment. And then it goes back down again. That's just the nature, just a rhythmic thing like the moon is rhythmic. Which is why we often associate poems of the moon, as Graves spoke about them, as poems that come from the unconscious. And these are poems that make the hair in the back of our neck stand up, that are moments of ecstasy and beauty and truth. A mating has occurred. So what I brought you through is a pretty large statement, and it looks like it's taken me almost 30 some odd minutes to go through it. But I think that you have a pretty general idea now of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about poems are the result of a psychic event that occurs when the unconscious wants to rise up and to mate with its conscious other half, his brother or sister, depending whether you're male or female. You can think of it either way. And it has to be treated like a brother. It has to be honored. It has to be respected. You don't really know. It can be jealous. It can be envious. It can be angry. It can be out of control, just like brothers can be, You never know what your brother's going to do. He's crazy all of a sudden, and he's loving. And, I had a brother like that, so I know as a kid. And they probably looked at me the same way. We came from a large family, so there's a lot of juice moving around. But it's the brother of man. The unconscious is the brother of the humans, and it has to be respected. And poetry is the way that occurs. Poetry is not rhyme. It's not a lot of high thoughts. That's all extra, whatever you want to think. Poetry is a heart, a feeling communication, a becoming whole again with the unconscious. And what happens is that we get the fruit of the unconscious, which is that complex of feelings, comes into words so that it realizes itself in our conscious life. And it gives us that moment of knowing, that awareness of who we are. And then the unconscious gets it back. What it gets back is not the words. It doesn't care about the words. The words, it could care less, What it wants to get is the feeling engendered by the words, by the rhythmic metaphor. Especially when you speak it out, I think that the unconscious, although when you write poems too, it has the really same effect, but it takes you longer to get the poem written. It's like you get inspiration and you just play it on a trumpet and it goes back and the unconscious gets its thrill. What it wants to feel our humanity. It doesn't have that. It's still an animal consciousness for all intents and purposes. It can't tell stories. It can just give us the emotions that through some miracle of being human produce a story that is charged, rhythmic, metaphoric, revealing, and brings us a moment of ecstasy in which we become fully human. That's what poetry is all about. So what we're going to do over the next Sundays is we're going to just basically just revolve around that and go through some examples, and I'll go back into some of Jung, and I'll go back into ancient poetry to give you some idea what that was like if you're interested. Very few poets know much about it. It's a shame. It's that I think that poetry is one of the few arts that in fact does not honor its past. I know dance does, and the visual arts do. We can see that in Picasso bringing back all the primitive masks, and we can see it in dance bringing those moves back too. Somehow or other we become just too fancy, and we've forgotten about what the heart of poetry is, and we're just kind of diddling around with the surface of it so we can get a promotion in the world of whatever. But my feeling about poetry is we should become less writers and we should become more poets. And that's what will affect the lives of people around us, and especially our own lives. Because if you don't live a life of harmony within yourself, and poetry is the way to do that, if you open yourself to it and don't just moving the words around like crazy trying to get a Pulitzer, then in fact you'll live a better life. But you have to surrender to it. You can't be boss all the time. Got that? You can't be boss all the time. You got to let go. All right. I think that's enough of the broadcast. I'm going to bring you in our little thing here where we can, our little sign-off. In fact, I'm going to sign off right now with a poem. Let me just hold this a second here. Let me just get this here, get rid of this. I'm going to sign off with a poem that is a real poem. And let me get it here. It's what I call dream stories, but it's basically, the very same thing that in fact I'm talking about in the way of a contemporary version of pre-literate poetry. And the way that these are created is I create a series of pictures about something that interests me. I generally have no idea why it interests me. They just do. And these were taken both by myself and by a photographer who was also a poet by the name of La Robina, who lived in Mexico with us at the time, and who took these pictures of me on a certain day, and when she brought them over, I mixed them with some I had taken, and all of a sudden I could feel a poem trying to come out of me. It's one of the techniques we use. So I'm going to start this up, make a few adjustments, and here we go, and let's take a look at this poem, and then we'll just use that as a sign-off, okay? Hope I didn't scare you.
Whenever I come to see you, it's such a long, hard walk, and you're never there. Only the empty room and my shadow. No one to step between us, between the man at the door and myself. I don't know where I'm going anymore. I seem lost in memories or awakenings. Only my other self knows where I'm going and where I've been. I don't know anything anymore. I'm in a white room, and then I think I'm climbing to heaven, and then I'm all alone somewhere. This is where the dead are buried, and this is where I've come to be with you. Everything changes here, just like the day changes from morning to evening. And just the thought of you makes the colors in my mind go wild. If I could find you, I would pull you up from the earth and speak to you and tell you who I am here in this graveyard of bones. Each night I knock at your door and wait for you to come, but you never do. There are only dreams of memories and memories of dreams and the long road back to where I live by myself with you. Here I am again.